Good evening, Seekers. In the last chapter, we opened the third book by asking what civilization really was before it had a name. We looked at it not as a sudden invention, but as a slow change in the way human beings lived together. A shelter became more than a place to pass through. A fire became something people returned to. A path became familiar beneath many feet. The first signs of civilization were not always carved in stone. Sometimes they were quieter than that. They were found in the decision to stay near a place long enough for memory to gather there. Tonight, we follow that memory to the river. Before the first great cities rose from the earth, water was already shaping the lives of the people who would build them. A river gave more than drink. It gave a reason to look at the land differently. For people who had long survived by moving with the seasons, the river offered a rare kind of promise. It did not remove hardship, and it did not make life easy, but it made return possible. Even when the banks shifted or the flood came too high, the river remained a presence that could be studied, trusted, feared, and remembered. Imagine a small group arriving at the same bend in the water year after year. At first, it may have been only a useful stopping place. The ground was soft enough for digging. The reeds gave shelter from the wind. Fish moved in the shallows. Birds gathered at certain times of year. The people who came there would have learned the shape of the bank and the sound of the current. They would have known where the mud held firm beneath the feet and where the water became dangerous after rain. Over time, the place would no longer feel like one place among many. It would feel known. That is one of the quiet beginnings of civilization. A place becomes familiar enough that people begin to plan around it. They leave something behind because they expect to return. They remember what grew well there. They notice what the flood changed. They teach children the safest path to the water. They begin to think of the land not only as something to pass through, but as something that can hold a future. The river made this kind of future easier to imagine because it carried rhythm through the landscape. It rose and fell. It left soil behind. It drew animals and plants toward its banks. It gave early communities a pattern they could learn through attention and experience. A single good season did not create a village, and a single harvest did not create a city. But repeated seasons could change the way people understood their own lives. When the same water returned and the same fields could be worked again, staying began to make sense. Staying changed everything. People who stayed could build with more care. They could store food against leaner months. They could repair what the weather damaged. They could plant with the hope that someone would still be there when the grain was ready. A life shaped by movement had its own deep intelligence, but a life shaped by return asked different things of people. It asked them to wait. It asked them to share work across time. It asked them to trust that tomorrow could be prepared for. This is where the river becomes more than a setting for ancient history. It becomes one of the first great teachers of human organization. The water could bless a field, but it could also destroy a home. It could feed a family, but it could not be controlled by one family alone. As more people gathered near its banks, they had to learn how to work beside one another. They had to decide where fields would go, how water would be shared, how food would be stored, and how disputes would be settled when the needs of one household touched the survival of another. From those practical problems, larger worlds began to grow. Long before there were famous kings and monuments, there were communities learning how to live with water. Long before writing preserved the names of rulers, people were watching floods, repairing banks, planting after the mud had dried, and learning that the river's pattern could become the pattern of their year. So we begin chapter 2 beside the rivers that built the first worlds. We begin before the great stories became ancient, before temples rose above crowded streets, before scribes pressed the memory of cities into clay. We begin with people standing near moving water and slowly realizing that a place could become home, that a season could become a calendar, and that the future might be something human hands could prepare for. Section 2. The first people who stayed near rivers did not step into an easy life. It can be tempting to imagine the riverbank as a gentle place where food appeared and fields grew almost by themselves, but the truth was more demanding. Water brought possibility, and possibility had to be learned. A river could not be treated like a still pond or a simple spring. It moved according to forces that began far beyond the village, in distant rain, melting snow, hidden channels, and storms no one beside the bank could see. To live near a river was to live with a power that was both generous and unstable. One year, the flood might arrive in time and leave the fields dark with new soil. Another year, it might come too weak, and the ground would harden beneath the sun. A flood that was too strong could tear through the places people had trusted. It could take walls, tools, stored food, and lives in a single night. So the river did not simply reward people for staying, it taught them to pay attention. Over generations, that attention became knowledge. People learned the smell of wet earth before the water rose. They learned which ground could hold a shelter and which ground belonged to the river during flood season. They learned that the richest soil often came after danger had passed, when the water withdrew and left behind a dark layer of silt. This mud was not waste. It was the beginning of harvest. It was the reason the same field could be used again. It was the river leaving part of itself behind. That gift changed the meaning of land. In many places, soil could wear out or dry away until people had to move on. Along the rivers, the earth could be renewed. A floodplain was not just open ground, it was a living surface that changed with the year. The people who understood it best were not simply lucky farmers. They were careful readers of place. They knew when to plant, when to wait, when to move animals away from low ground, and when to repair what the water had damaged. This kind of life required memory that stretched beyond one person. A child might see only a handful of floods before becoming grown, but a community could remember many. Elders could speak of the year the water rose higher than anyone expected, or the year it failed and hunger followed. Those memories mattered because they helped people prepare for what had not yet happened. In this way, the river made the past useful. It turned experience into protection. The river also made work more connected. A small garden could belong to one household, but a channel that guided water across many fields belonged to everyone who depended on it. If it filled with silt, many people suffered. If it broke, many people repaired it. If one family took too much water, another family might lose a crop. These were not abstract problems, they were daily pressures that pushed people toward agreement, leadership, obligation, and rules. That is one reason river valleys became such powerful settings for early civilization. They did not simply allow people to grow food, they forced people to organize around the growing of food. The river created abundance, but it also created shared risk. It made cooperation practical. It made planning necessary. It made memory valuable enough to preserve. Before there were palaces or written laws, there were people learning how to live with floodwater and mud. They watched the river because the river decided the shape of the year. They worked together because survival had become larger than one household. They returned after damage because the same water that had frightened them could also feed them. Slowly, through this long relationship with moving water, human beings began to build not just shelters beside rivers, but societies shaped by them. Section 3. As people learned to live beside rivers, they also learned to live with waiting. This may have been one of the deepest changes in the ancient world. A hunter could follow the movement of animals and a gatherer could search the land for what was ready that day, but farming asked the mind to stretch forward. A seed placed in the ground was not food anymore. It was a promise made to the future. That promise was never certain. The seed could fail. The water could come too late. Birds could strip the field. Insects could arrive in numbers too great to fight. A storm could flatten what had taken months to grow. Yet the people who remained near rivers saw that the same act, repeated with care, could bring back more than it cost. Grain was small enough to hold in the palm, but it carried a new way of thinking inside it. It taught people to trust a season they could not yet see. This changed the rhythm of daily life. Work no longer followed only the need of the moment. It followed a longer pattern. Fields had to be prepared before they looked useful. Water had to be guided before the dry weeks came. Grain had to be stored before hunger arrived. Tools had to be kept for work that was still months away. The future became something that could be shaped by what people did now. Storage may sound ordinary, but it was one of the quiet revolutions of settled life. When food could be kept, time itself changed. A good harvest did not have to be eaten at once. It could be protected for a later season, traded for things the village did not make, offered in ceremony, or used to feed people while they built, repaired, traveled, or defended the settlement. Stored grain gave a community weight. It allowed life to continue when the fields were bare. But storage also brought new problems. Food that could be saved could also be stolen. Food that could be counted could be controlled. A full storehouse meant safety during a hard season, but it also raised difficult questions about who guarded it, who measured it, and who decided how it would be shared. The same grain that protected a village could become a source of power within it. This is one of the reasons the river worlds grew more complicated over time. As harvests became larger and communities became more settled, people needed ways to manage what they had made. They needed trust, but trust alone was not always enough. They needed memory that could survive argument. They needed marks, seals, measures, and eventually records. They needed some way to say that this much grain had been gathered, this much had been given, this much was owed, and this much must remain until the next season. The beginning of civilization was not only a story of beauty and invention, it was also a story of pressure. The river allowed people to grow more food, and more food allowed more people to live together. More people created more work, more decisions, more disagreements, and more need for order. The harvest filled the village, but it also made the village harder to govern. Still, beneath all of that complexity was the simple act of planting and waiting. A person pressed seed into the dark soil and trusted that the river, the sun, and the labor of many hands would bring it back, transformed. From that trust came fields. From fields came storehouses. From storehouses came records and authority. Slowly, the small promise inside a seed became one of the foundations of the ancient world. Section 4. Along the Tigris and Euphrates, the old relationship between water and settlement became one of the great turning points in human history. These two rivers ran through a land that could be harsh and uncertain, a land where the heat pressed heavily on the open plain and where rainfall could not always be trusted. Yet the rivers carried water down from distant mountains and made life possible in places that might otherwise have remained too dry for large communities to grow. The people who settled there did not find a ready-made paradise. They found a difficult landscape with one enormous advantage, and over time they learned how to turn that advantage into a world. This region would later be called Mesopotamia, the land between rivers. The name is simple, but it contains almost everything that mattered. The rivers were not background features. They were the structure around which life had to be arranged. Villages grew where water could be reached and fields could be fed. Canals carried the river into land that needed it. Mud from the banks became bricks. Reeds became roofing and baskets. Boats moved along waterways that linked one settlement to another. Slowly, the plain began to hold more people than it could have held without planning. The work was never finished. A canal that brought water one year could fill with silt the next. A field that had been fertile could weaken if water was handled badly. Floods could come with little warning and leave ruin behind them. So the people of Mesopotamia had to become builders in the deepest sense. They built not only houses and walls, but systems of care around the river. They learned to dig, repair, measure, and organize. They learned that survival depended on keeping the water moving where it was needed and keeping it away where it could destroy. From this kind of labor, some of the earliest cities began to rise. Places such as Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash, and Nippur became more than large villages. They became centers of worship, storage, trade, craft, and authority. Their streets and courtyards held the daily work of thousands of people whose lives were connected by grain, water, obligation, and belief. A farmer working a field outside the city was still tied to the temple within it. A potter shaping clay was part of a larger world of exchange. A boat moving along a canal could carry food, goods, messages, and news from one place to another. As these cities grew, memory became harder to hold in the mind alone. A small group can remember who owes what, which field belongs to whom, and how much grain was stored after the harvest. A city cannot depend on memory in the same way. Too many hands are involved. Too much food moves through storehouses. Too many promises need to survive beyond a single conversation. So the people of Mesopotamia began pressing signs into clay, first for practical reasons, to keep track of goods, labor, offerings, and debts. The earliest writing was not born as literature. It began as a way to manage a world that had become too large to remember by voice alone. There is something wonderfully human about that. The first written marks were not grand speeches about eternity. They were the marks of people trying to keep order in the middle of growth. They were shaped by the same forces that shaped the fields and canals. Water made harvests possible. Harvests made storage necessary. Storage made counting important. Counting made records useful. From the river came the city, and from the city came the need to make memory visible. Over time, those clay marks would become more than accounts. They would carry laws, hymns, myths, letters, royal commands, school exercises, and stories of gods and kings. But beneath all of that, later beauty was the practical world of the river plain, where people had gathered in such numbers that speech alone could no longer hold the weight of their lives. In Mesopotamia, civilization became something written because the river had helped make human life dense, connected, and complicated. So, when we imagine the first cities between the Tigris and Euphrates, we should not see them only as ruins under a bright desert sky. We should imagine a living place of mud brick walls, canal water, temple steps, crowded markets, stored grain, and people whose days were shaped by both labor and belief. Their world was difficult, but it was also astonishingly creative. Out of river mud, they made fields, bricks, tablets, and cities. Out of the need to remember, they made writing. And out of the struggle to live together beside uncertain waters, they helped begin the long recorded story of civilization. Section 5. Along the Nile, the story of the river took on a different shape. In Mesopotamia, water could feel uncertain and difficult to command, but in Egypt, the river moved with a rhythm that seemed almost sacred. The Nile flowed through a narrow green world held between deserts, and each year its flood returned with a kind of majesty that shaped the imagination of everyone who lived beside it. The land did not depend on scattered rainfall in the same way other places did. It depended on the river's rise, on the dark soil the water carried, and on the slow retreat of the flood that left the fields ready to be worked. For the ancient Egyptians, this yearly renewal was not a small event in the background of life. It was the center of life. The river rose, covered the land, and then withdrew, leaving behind the black earth that made farming possible. Out beyond that narrow ribbon of fertility stretched the desert, bright and dry and silent. The contrast was so strong that Egypt itself could seem divided between two worlds. There was the green land of life along the Nile, and there was the red land beyond it, where the desert waited under the sun. This shaped more than farming. It shaped the Egyptian sense of order. When the flood came as expected, the world felt balanced. Fields could be planted, grain could be gathered, boats could move along the river, villages and cities could remain connected across great distance. The Nile did not simply feed Egypt, it joined Egypt together. A settlement far upstream and another far downstream were part of the same flowing body, bound by the water that moved between them. That unity mattered. Egypt was long and narrow, and the river gave it a natural path through itself. Boats could carry people, stone, grain, messages, and royal authority along the same route that carried the flood. The Nile made movement easier in a landscape where the desert on either side could be difficult and dangerous. It allowed power to travel. It allowed ideas to travel. It allowed the kingdom to feel like one continuous world, stretched along the water like a thread. The flood also gave the Egyptians a powerful way to think about time. Every year, the land seemed to die into water and return as food. The seed disappeared into the dark soil and rose again. The sun vanished each evening and returned each morning. These patterns were not separate from religion. They were religion's living evidence. The world was full of return, and the river showed it with a clarity that no stone carving could improve. This is one reason Egyptian civilization became so deeply concerned with eternity. To people who lived beside the Nile, renewal was not an abstract hope. It happened in the fields. It happened in the sky. It happened in the rivers rising and falling. Death did not have to mean an end if the deepest patterns of the world were patterns of return. The body might fail, but perhaps the soul could travel onward. A king might die, but perhaps he could join a larger order beyond the visible world. A name carved in stone might keep a person present long after the voice had gone silent. So the Nile fed both the body and the imagination. It made harvests possible, but it also made Egypt's great dream of endurance feel believable. Temples, tombs, pyramids, offerings, prayers, and painted walls all belonged to a world where the river had taught people that life could emerge again from darkness. The Egyptian desire to preserve was not only fear of death, it was trust in a pattern they saw around them every year. When we think of Egypt now, it is easy to see the monuments first and the river second. The pyramids rise so powerfully in memory that they can seem to stand alone. But they did not come from nowhere. They rose from a society made possible by the Nile, by its fields, its boats, its floods, and its long green corridor through the desert. Stone reached toward eternity because grain had first grown in the mud. Beside the Nile, civilization became a search for lasting order. The river gave Egypt its food, its road, its calendar, and much of its sacred imagination. It taught the people who lived there to see the world as something that could be renewed if balance was kept. And from that belief came one of the most enduring civilizations the world has ever known, a river kingdom where the movement of water became the measure of life itself. Section 6. Farther east, Another river world grew with a quieter voice. Along the Indus and the lands around it, cities rose that still feel strangely calm when we study them today. They do not come to us with the same loudness as Egypt or Mesopotamia. We do not have kings whose names dominate the story. We do not have long royal inscriptions explaining victories, laws, or divine favor. The writing of the Indus people remains unread, so their own words are still closed to us. Yet the remains of their cities show a civilization of remarkable care, intelligence, and order. The best known of these places are Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. They were not random clusters of houses pressed together by accident. Their streets were laid out with planning. Their bricks were made in standard sizes. Their homes were connected to systems of drainage that ran beneath the streets. Wells and bathing spaces were part of daily life. The city was shaped around water, not only as something to drink or use in fields, but as something that had to be guided through the routines of ordinary living. That detail matters because it gives the Indus world a different feeling. In some ancient cities, power announces itself through giant monuments or palaces built to overwhelm the eye. In the Indus cities, what impresses us is often quieter. It is the regular brick, the careful street, the drain that still shows how much thought was given to cleanliness, comfort, and order. These were not small achievements. They required shared standards, skilled workers, planning across neighborhoods, and a level of civic organization that could shape the habits of thousands of people. A city like Mohenjo-daro must have been full of sound and movement in its own time. People walked through its streets carrying water, food, tools, cloth, and goods from workshops. Craftspeople shaped beads, pottery, seals, and ornaments with impressive skill. Traders connected the Indus world to distant regions, including Mesopotamia, where objects and materials from this Eastern civilization were known. Families lived in houses whose walls have outlasted their voices. Children learned the paths between rooms, wells, courtyards, and streets. Life there was not silent then. It is silent now because we cannot yet read it fully. That silence can make the Indus civilization feel mysterious, but it should not make it feel empty. The mystery is not that these people were unknowable in every way. The mystery is that they built so well and yet left us without the kind of explanation we are used to. Their seals show animals, signs, and figures whose meanings remain debated. Their cities suggest authority, but not clearly the kind of authority that built pyramids or carved kings into stone. They remind us that civilization did not have only one shape. Water shaped this world as deeply as it shaped the others. The Indus system and its neighboring rivers fed fields, supported trade, and allowed settlements to grow across a wide region. But rivers are never fixed forever. Channels can shift. Floods can damage what seemed secure. Climate can change slowly enough that generations adapt without realizing a whole world is being transformed beneath them. Over time, the great urban centers of the Indus civilization declined, and people moved into different patterns of life. The ending does not seem to have been one simple collapse in a single night. It was more like a long unwinding. That makes the Indus cities especially haunting. They show us a civilization that was practical, skilled, organized, and deeply connected to water, yet much of its inner life remains just beyond reach. We can walk its streets in imagination, but we cannot yet hear its stories in its own language. We can see the drains, the wells, the brick platforms, and the careful planning, but we do not know what prayers were spoken there, what songs were sung, what names were given to the river, or what people believed would last. Beside the Indus, the ancient world teaches a quieter lesson. A civilization does not need to shout across time to be great. Sometimes it leaves behind order rather than boasts. Sometimes its most powerful monuments are not towers, but streets, not royal faces carved in stone, but a city built so carefully that thousands of years later, we can still sense the discipline of the people who made it. The river gave them life, and they answered with a world of brick, water, craft, and quiet design. Section 7. As the river worlds grew, daily life became more connected than it had ever been before. A person could still know the feel of their own field, their own doorway, their own family's work, but they were no longer living only inside a small circle of need. The grain in one house might depend on a channel repaired by many hands. The clay jar in another might have been shaped by a potter who traded for food grown outside the city. A boatman passing along the water might carry news from a settlement no one nearby had ever visited. Little by little, the river made separate lives part of a larger pattern. This was one of the quiet powers of water. It did not only feed the fields, it carried things. A river could move goods farther and more easily than people could carry them across dry ground. Heavy jars, bundles of reeds, timber, stone, grain, oil, and cloth could travel along the current or be pushed against it by labor and skill. The boat became one of civilization's early instruments of connection, not because it looked impressive, but because it made distance easier to cross. Places that might have remained separate could begin to know one another. Trade changed what a community could become. A settlement did not have to produce everything for itself if it could exchange what it had in abundance for what it lacked. One place might have good clay, another might have stone, another might have timber from farther away, another might sit near metals or shells or rare materials that became valuable because they came from beyond the familiar world. As these things moved, they carried more than usefulness. They carried signs of elsewhere. For the people who lived in early cities, an object from far away must have had a special kind of presence. A stone bead, a carved seal, a piece of metal, or a fine vessel could speak silently of distant hands and distant landscapes. It proved that the world extended beyond the fields and streets a person knew. It suggested other rivers, other languages, other gods, other ways of shaping a pot or measuring a field or honoring the dead. Trade did not only move goods, it widened imagination. The rivers made this widening possible by turning geography into connection. A city beside water could become a meeting place for farmers, fishers, herders, craft workers, merchants, priests, officials, travelers, and strangers. Some came to sell, some came to worship, some came under command, some came because hunger or opportunity had pushed them away from home. Whatever brought them there, their arrival changed the city. More people meant more stories, more skills, more conflict, more exchange, and more need for order. This is where early cities became more than collections of houses. They became centers. Around them, fields sent grain inward. Workshops turned raw material into objects of value. Storehouses gathered food. Temples gathered offerings. Markets gathered voices. Boats moved along the water with the slow confidence of a world learning to connect itself. A city could begin to pull the life of a whole region toward it, not by magic, but by usefulness. Yet, connection also brought pressure. If more goods moved through a city, then more had to be measured and trusted. If more strangers arrived, then customs had to stretch or harden. If more wealth gathered in one place, then more people wanted to protect it, control it, or take it. The river made exchange possible, but exchange made society more complicated. Abundance attracted ambition. Movement created opportunity, but also danger. Still, the ancient river cities kept growing because connection was powerful. a community that could receive grain from its fields, stone from distant hills, timber from another region, and ideas from travelers, was no longer only surviving in place. It was becoming part of a wider world. The river gave that world a path. Along it, people learned that civilization was not just what they built at home. It was also what arrived from beyond the bend in the water. Section 8. As cities grew beside rivers, the sacred life of those cities grew with them. The people who lived along the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Nile, and the Indus did not see the world as a silent machine of soil and weather. They lived inside a universe that felt alive with powers. The river was powerful. The flood was powerful. The sun that ripened the fields was powerful. The storm that ruined them was powerful. Birth, illness, drought, harvest, death, and luck all seemed to move through forces larger than any human hand. So the first cities were not only practical places, they were sacred places. Their temples and ritual spaces were not decorations added after the real work was done. They belonged to the work itself. A community that depended on water and grain also depended on meaning. People needed to know why the river rose, why the sky withheld rain, why sickness came into a house, why one harvest failed while another fed the whole settlement. They needed stories large enough to hold fear and gratitude at the same time. In Mesopotamia, the temple stood near the heart of the city because the gods were believed to be near the heart of life. A city was not only a human settlement, it was also the home of a divine presence, and that presence had to be honored, fed, clothed, praised, and served. The temple gathered offerings from the fields and received the labor of many people. It became a place where grain, animals, craft, ceremony, and authority met. To care for the god was also to care for the order of the city, because the city's survival depended on a relationship with powers that could not be ignored. This may sound strange from far away, but for the people of the river valleys, it would have made a deep kind of sense. Their lives were built around forces they could study, but never fully command. They could dig canals, store food, and watch the sky, but they could not make the flood arrive gently or guarantee that the fields would live. Ritual gave shape to that uncertainty. It made fear speakable. It turned helplessness into action. A prayer before the flood or an offering after harvest was not separate from survival. It was part of how survival was understood. The same was true in Egypt, where the Nile's yearly return helped form a vision of cosmic balance. Order was not only a political idea, it was something the whole world required. If balance failed, chaos waited. The river's rhythm, the sun's journey, the king's duty, the temple's offerings, and the farmer's labor all belonged to the same imagined structure. A good harvest was not merely a result of water and mud, it was a sign that the world was still holding together. In these early civilizations, religion also helped connect ordinary life to time beyond a single lifetime. The dead were remembered, ancestors mattered, names mattered. The care of graves and tombs gave families a way to remain tied to those who had gone before them. In a settled world, the dead could stay close. They did not vanish into the distance as people moved on. They became part of the land, part of the household memory, part of the reason a place felt rooted. This was another quiet change brought by settled life. When people stayed near the same river for generations, memory had somewhere to gather. Stories attached themselves to fields, shrines, bends in the water, old walls and burial places. The sacred was not only above them in the sky, it was around them in the landscape. A city could become holy because the lives of many generations had settled into it. The river worlds were built from labor, but they were held together by belief as much as by brick. Fields had to be planted and canals had to be cleared, yet people also needed rituals that explained why their work mattered. They needed ceremonies that marked the seasons. They needed gods who stood behind the waters and the grain. They needed stories that made the city feel like more than a crowded place of hunger, trade, and labor. Beside the rivers, civilization became both material and sacred. Mud became brick, grain became wealth, water became order, and the city became a meeting place between human effort and the unseen powers people believed surrounded them. To build near a river was not only to make a living, it was to take part in a world where every flood, every harvest, and every season seemed to carry a meaning deeper than survival. Section 9. As river cities became larger and more settled, people began to look more carefully at the sky above them. This was not because they had grown distant from the earth, it was because the earth had taught them to notice patterns, and the sky seemed to hold patterns even older and more mysterious than the river itself. The moon changed its shape and returned. Certain stars appeared at certain times of year. The sun rose in different places along the horizon as the seasons moved. Night after night, the heavens turned with a silence that made them feel less like empty darkness and more like a kind of great memory. For people whose lives depended on planting, flooding, harvest, and storage, these patterns mattered. A season could not be guessed casually when the survival of a whole community depended on being ready. Fields had to be prepared before the right moment passed. Workers had to be gathered. Offerings had to be made. Boats had to move when water allowed them to move. Grain had to be counted after harvest and protected before hunger returned. The sky became one more way to understand where the year was taking them. In Egypt, the rising of a bright star before dawn came to be associated with the season of the Nile's flood. To people watching from the dark edge of the river, that appearance would not have felt like a small detail. It was a sign that the great cycle was turning again. The river would rise, the fields would be covered, the black earth would return. The star, the water, and the soil belonged to one rhythm. A person who understood that rhythm could feel for a moment that the world was not random. In Mesopotamia, generations of observers watched the heavens with extraordinary care. They recorded the moon, the planets, eclipses, and unusual events in the sky because they believed these movements had meaning for life below. Some of that meaning belonged to religion and omen. Some of it belonged to timekeeping and prediction. The two were not separate in the way we often separate them now. To watch the sky was to study both the order of nature and the possible intentions of the divine. This is important to understand. Ancient knowledge did not begin as a clean division between science and belief. The same person who watched the moon to mark a month might also wonder what its appearance meant for the king, the harvest, or the city. The same sky could be a calendar, a warning, a sacred text, and a source of wonder. These people were not careless observers. They were often patient, disciplined, and practical. Their world simply did not place hard walls between usefulness and meaning. The river had already taught them that survival depended on attention. The sky extended that lesson upward. If water had a season, perhaps the stars did too. If floods returned in patterns, perhaps the heavens also returned in patterns. Slowly, human beings began to place their own lives inside larger cycles. A day belonged to the sun, a month belonged to the moon, a year belonged to the turning seasons. The city, with all its noise and work, was set beneath a vast order that no king had built. Calendars grew from this need to live in time with the world. They helped people remember festivals, prepare fields, organize labor, and mark the duties of temple and state. They gave shape to the year so that communities could move together through it. Without a shared sense of time, a large settlement becomes difficult to govern. With one, the work of many people can be gathered into a rhythm that feels almost natural. So the first river civilizations were not only looking down at mud and fields, they were also looking up. They were learning that the world had more than one current. There was the river moving through the land, and there was the river of stars moving through the night. Between those two motions, people found ways to plant, pray, count, remember, and wait. Civilization grew in that space between earth and sky, where human beings began to believe that if they could read the signs of the world carefully enough, they might live in harmony with forces far greater than themselves. Section 10. By the time the first river cities had grown large enough to hold temples, storehouses, workshops, and crowded neighborhoods, life had become too complex to depend on memory alone. In a smaller community, people could often remember what had been promised, who had helped with a harvest, which family had used a certain field, and what had been stored for the difficult months ahead. But cities placed too much weight on ordinary memory. Grain moved in large amounts. Workers came and went. Offerings were collected. Goods were traded. Debts were made. Land was measured. Decisions had to outlast the people who first spoke them. This need to remember changed the ancient world. Before writing became a way to preserve myths, laws, letters, and royal names, it began as a practical answer to the pressure of settled life. In Mesopotamia, people pressed marks into soft clay to record goods and numbers. Clay was everywhere along the river plains, and it held a mark beautifully. A tablet could be shaped by hand, written while damp, and then dried hard enough to carry memory beyond the moment. What had once depended on spoken trust could now be held in a small piece of earth. There is something fitting about that. The same river mud that helped make bricks for houses also helped make tablets for memory. The city was built from the ground beneath people's feet, and its records were made from that ground as well. A scribe pressing a reed into clay was doing more than counting grain. He was helping create a new relationship with time. A spoken agreement fades unless people remember it. A mark in clay remains. It can be checked, carried, stored, disputed, copied, and read again by someone who was not present when the agreement was made. Writing did not make the ancient world simple. In many ways, it showed how complicated the world had become. The more a city produced, the more it needed to record. The more it traded, the more it needed measures and seals. The more people worked for temples or rulers, the more labor had to be organized. A tablet could hold the memory of barley, sheep, wages, land, beer, oil, offerings, or taxes. These records may sound plain beside later stories of gods and kings, but they reveal the machinery of civilization as clearly as any monument. The rise of scribes also created a new kind of power. Most people could not write. Most people could not read the marks that stored the city's memory. Those who could became essential to temples, palaces, merchants, and officials. A scribe stood between speech and permanence. He could turn a transaction into a record, a command into an instruction, a harvest into an account, and a name into something that might survive. In a world where memory had become power, literacy became one of the quietest and strongest tools a person could possess. Over time, writing widened beyond accounting. Once people learned to preserve one kind of memory, they began preserving others. Hymns, prayers, laws, school lessons, royal inscriptions, and stories found their way into clay, stone, and other materials. The practical marks of city life opened a path toward literature and history. The first written stories did not appear from nowhere. They grew out of a world already trained to make memory visible. This matters because it reminds us that civilization is not only made of buildings, it is also made of systems that allow people to agree on what happened. A city needs food, water, labor, and walls, but it also needs shared memory. It needs a way to say what belongs to whom, what was promised, what was owed, what was decided, and what should be remembered after the witnesses are gone. Without that, the city is always in danger of forgetting itself. Beside the rivers, human beings learned to store grain against hunger. Then they learned to store words against time. Both acts came from the same desire to prepare for what was not yet here. A full granary protected the body through a hard season. A written record protected the order of the city through uncertainty, distance, and death. In the river worlds, clay became one of the first vessels of civilization, holding not water or grain, but memory itself. Section 11. Every river civilization lived with the same uncomfortable truth. The forces that made life possible could never be fully controlled. People could study the water for generations and still be surprised by it. They could build canals, raise banks, store grain, and mark the seasons with care, yet one bad flood or one long, dry year could still reveal how fragile their world really was. Civilization did not remove danger. It gathered people together so they could face danger with more tools, more memory, and more organization than they had before. This is easy to forget when we look back at ancient cities from a great distance. Ruins can make civilization seem solid. Stone walls, temple platforms, carved names, baked bricks, and old roads give the impression of permanence. But the people who lived inside those worlds would have known how much effort permanence required. A city was not something built once and then left to stand on its own. It had to be fed every year, its canals had to be cleared, its fields had to be protected, its storehouses had to be watched, its gods had to be honored, its workers had to be organized, its rulers had to prove that they could keep order when the world became uncertain. The river tested that order constantly. When water arrived in the right amount, life could feel blessed and stable. When it failed, the weakness of the whole system began to show. A poor harvest did not remain a problem in the field. It moved into the house, the market, the temple, and the palace. It changed what people owed and what they could pay. It made stored grain more precious. It made leaders more powerful or more vulnerable. Hunger could loosen trust between neighbors and turn ordinary disagreements into something sharper. Too much water could be just as dangerous. A flood that broke through defenses could undo years of work in hours. Homes built with care could soften and collapse. Stored food could be ruined. Boundary lines between fields could vanish beneath mud. Families might return after the water withdrew and find that the place they knew had changed shape. Even when the flood left fertile soil behind, it could leave grief with it. The river's gift was never separate from its threat. This is why early civilization depended so deeply on maintenance. The grandest parts of the ancient world were supported by ordinary work repeated without glory. Someone cleared silt from a channel. Someone repaired a wall after rain. Someone checked a storehouse door. Someone carried seed to a field that had failed before. Someone remembered where the water had risen in a dangerous year and warned others not to build too low. These acts rarely become famous, but without them, the famous things could not have lasted. Over time, the need for maintenance became part of the structure of society. Communities needed people who could direct labor, settle disputes, keep records, guard resources, and speak for the group in times of stress. This gave civilization strength, but it also created tension. The same systems that protected people could also burden them. A ruler who organized canals could demand labor. A temple that stored grain could decide who received it. A record that preserved order could also preserve debt. The river worlds gave people new security, but that security came with new forms of dependence. So the rise of civilization was not a simple story of progress. It was a long negotiation with risk. People gathered near rivers because those rivers made life richer and more reliable, but once they gathered, they became tied to systems that had to keep working. The field depended on water, the household depended on the harvest, the city depended on storage, the temple and palace depended on the labor of many lives moving in the same direction. If one part failed badly enough, the whole structure could tremble. This makes the ancient river worlds feel more human, not less. They were not perfect machines of kings, temples, and grain. They were communities trying to survive inside powerful landscapes. They were built by people who knew that order was precious because disorder was always close. Each season asked them the same question in a different form. Could they remember enough, work together enough, and prepare well enough to meet what the river brought next? In that question, we can hear one of the oldest truths of civilization. To build a world is not only to raise walls or plant fields, it is to care for what has been built before it disappears. The river gave early people the chance to settle, grow, trade, worship, and write, but it also reminded them that every human world stands inside a larger one. The water could be guided, but never owned. The future could be prepared for, but never guaranteed. Section 12. As this chapter comes to rest, the first river worlds begin to look less like distant inventions and more like long conversations between people and place. The earliest civilizations did not rise because human beings suddenly became different from those who came before them. They rose because certain landscapes allowed old human skills to turn in a new direction. The ability to remember, to cooperate, to watch the weather, to follow animal movement, to care for children, to honor the dead, and to pass knowledge from one generation to the next had already lived in human communities for ages. Beside the rivers, those abilities began to settle into the land. A river gave people something rare. It gave them a pattern strong enough to build around, but uncertain enough to demand attention. Its water could feed a field, carry a boat, shape a boundary, renew the soil, or tear away the work of many years. No one who lived beside it could afford to be careless. To make a home near such power meant learning patience. It meant watching small changes before they became disasters. It meant trusting the experience of those who remembered earlier floods and harder seasons. It meant living with the knowledge that survival was no longer only a private matter because one household's choices could touch the fate of another. From that shared dependence came the deeper shape of civilization. People learned to plant with the future in mind, to store what the present did not immediately need, and to organize work that would matter months later. They learned that food could become security, and that security could become authority. They learned that memory could be strengthened by marks in clay, that water could become a road between settlements, and that a city could gather the life of a whole region into one crowded center of labor, belief, fear, and hope. Yet the river worlds were never only practical. The same waters that made farming possible also gave people a way to think about time, death, renewal, and order. In Egypt, the Nile's return helped make eternity feel almost visible. In Mesopotamia, the difficult rivers helped shape cities that wrote down the first heavy records of human life. Along the Indus, careful planning and quiet design left behind streets and drains that still speak, even while the words of their makers remain unread. Each river formed a different kind of world, but each taught people that a place could hold memory if enough lives were rooted there. This is why the first cities still matter. They were not perfect beginnings, and they were not simple triumphs. They brought protection, but also dependence. They brought abundance, but also control. They brought shared work, but also new burdens. To live inside civilization was to gain something powerful and to give something up. The open path became a field. The temporary shelter became a house. The remembered season became a calendar. The spoken promise became a record. The riverbank became home. And maybe that is the quietest truth of these ancient places. Civilization began not only when people learned how to build, but when they learned how much could be built by staying. Staying long enough to understand the water, staying long enough to bury the dead nearby, staying long enough for children to inherit paths they did not have to discover for themselves, staying long enough for memory to gather weight until the land was no longer simply useful, but belonged to a story. Tonight, we have followed that story along the old waters that nourished the first great settlements. We have seen how rivers gave shape to fields, cities, calendars, temples, trade, records, and the first large communities whose traces still remain beneath the dust. In the next chapter, we will follow one river more deeply. We will turn toward Egypt, where the Nile carried a civilization into one of humanity's most powerful dreams of permanence. There, under a bright desert sky, stone would rise toward eternity, and the living would build houses for the dead, as if death itself were only another country beyond the water. For now, let the river move on in darkness. Let the fields rest beneath the night air. Let the old cities grow quiet along their banks. The people who built them are gone, but the pattern they discovered is still with us. Wherever human beings gather near water, make a home, store what they can, remember what came before, and prepare for what may come after, some part of those first river worlds is still flowing.